very much for coming, everybody. Thank you, Jay, for inviting me. Brings back very fond memories from 35 years ago when I had Jay in my class. Yeah, that was 35 years ago. Anyway, can't be denied. Well, today I'm going to be discussing the very topical issue of the culture wars, something we're all very familiar with. And sometimes it seems at present that the real energy in politics is in issues related to woke, however defined, issues of trans rights, issues of, I don't know, a drag queen story hour, all of these things. Those are really the issues that get people really energized, for better or worse. And it's really remarkable the extent to which other issues, including issues in unrelated areas, are often framed in terms of the culture wars. I'm impressed, for example, in how U.S. relations with Russia are seen through the eyes of the culture wars. The war in Ukraine is seen through the eyes of the culture wars. Russia is seen as a culturally traditionalist, sort of religious country, unfriendly to gays and feminism. So conservatives have some leaning towards it, whereas people on the left revile it, and that fundamentally influences the way people perceive the war in Ukraine, whether accurately or inaccurately. And so this really is what politics in the United States revolves around, more than anything else, I would say, at least on the surface, I suppose one of the things I want to suggest is that this really serves as a distraction from other issues, such as concentration of wealth and power, and it's not by accident but by design that happens. And so I'm going to discuss the origins of the culture wars and where they came from in the 1970s. This is part of the book that Jay described that I published just a few months ago. And what that book does, it looks at events in the 1970s through the perspective of historical archives. I particularly looked at the role of the very wealthy and what they were doing, and large business executives, and what they were saying privately to each other about what they were doing. And I looked at their papers over a period of many years. It took me 15 years to write this, and gained, I think, a pretty clear picture of what they were doing and why, and where the culture wars originated, and how they took such a virulent turn that they've taken in recent years. And the origins of this in the 1970s has to do with economics. And specifically that the period of the 1970s was one of economic crisis. Until then, the post-World War II economy of the United States performed actually very well. You had high rates of relatively stable growth. It was not just growth for the wealthy, but also growth for the working classes. Wages increased somewhat faster than profits did, if you can believe that, and the distribution of wealth, the gap between rich and poor, narrowed considerably to its most narrow level in U.S. history. The racial wage gap, the gap between the average wage and the African-American wage, which was enormous, began to narrow significantly, and had things gone on the way they were going, it probably would have disappeared by now. But in the 1970s, you had a crisis period, and you had a breakdown of growth. The economy did not grow robustly like it did in the past. And it was most notably manifested in terms of the most visible feature of the crisis was inflation, high rates of inflation. Although I would argue that was more of a symptom rather than the authentic problem. The underlying problem was low growth. And the question is, who did this hurt? Well, the answer is it hurt everybody. But the striking thing is, if you look at the data on it, it hurt the rich more than it hurt the poor during the 1970s. The fact is, basically, that wages were relatively stable until the end of the decade. They began to decline at the end of the decade, but for most of the decade, wages tended to go up with inflation. It was called the wage price spiral. As inflation went up, wages tend to go up with them. That's because in those days you had high rates of unionization, and unions acted as a brake on the ability of companies to cut wages. It's not true anymore, but then it was true. And inflation hit the wealthy the hardest because in conditions of inflation, it's very hard to maintain the value of accumulated wealth. And so the value of accumulated wealth began to decline during the 1970s. Also, the rate of profit was one of the lowest levels in American history. All right? And so the very rich were affected with you might say, a double whammy. High inflation that hurt them more than any other single group, and low rates of profit, which hurt them a second time. And if you read their papers, it's a remarkable sense of self-pity and self-regret, and talk about how they're they literally would talk about themselves as persecuted and treated. One executive said, in all seriousness and without irony, that the most mistreated and persecuted minority in America is corporate executives. Okay? So that's how they looked at themselves. Now, obviously, one can wince at that and say that that's an absurd thing to say, but that's how they viewed it. Okay? The question is, what do they do about it? And the answer was a massive mobilization politically. They first of all moved against the idea of labor unions. Most businesses had accepted labor unions. They'd come to terms with it. They accepted government regulation of the economy inherited from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. They accepted progressive taxation, all right? But under these new conditions of economic stress and crisis, they began adopting much more conservative economic doctrines associated above all with the very famous University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman and a whole coterie of economists associated with Milton Friedman who'd been relatively marginal to policymaking until the 70s. They'd been regarded as kind of far right and kind of the far right wing of the Republican Party. In the 70s, they became mainstream and became the dominant economic perspective. And as an institution, the University of Chicago replaced MIT as the country's central economics department, because MIT was still too mainstream. And what I think many people don't appreciate about Milton Friedman is one of the reasons he became so prominent is he had massive corporate backing, right? The corporate sector put enormous amounts of money in promoting his ideas, and there's no doubt that's one of the principal reasons he ascended in terms of his influence. You might say he provided the brains for a radical turn to the right on economic policy. And the overarching objective was to basically get rid of the New Deal, okay, get rid of labor unions, or at least reduce their influence, and redistribute wealth upwards, meaning from the poor to the rich. I should add, again, if you look at the data on wealth concentration in America, it became more equal. The most equal it became is in the 1970s. Why? Because, first of all, the long-term effects of the New Deal, but also the crisis of the 1970s, as I said, hit the wealthy harder than anyone else. This mobilization by the rich aimed to reverse that. And the rich have a real advantage in mobilization, which is this. If you're very rich, you have far more money than you can spend. Even no matter how hard you try, the super rich cannot spend all their money or anywhere close to all their money. And so they have enormous reserves that they can use to invest in politics when they choose to do so. And that's exactly what they did in the 1970s. And there was an enormous raising of funds in the business community to create new lobby groups. And the lobby groups were not traditional lobby groups. When one thinks of lobby groups, one thinks of organizations that have offices near Capitol Hill in Washington, typically on K Street in Washington, and they go into congressional offices and pester congressmen, congresswomen. They threaten them, they cajole them, maybe they try to bribe them legally or illegally, as the case may be. That's the image people have, and they have to register with the government, often with the Justice Department if they have foreign influence. All right? But what the very rich did was much more clever. They engaged in what I would call deep lobbying. Deep lobbying is not technically lobbying at all, not legally lobbying. It involves lobbying public opinion, all right? And they very consciously did this. The whole idea was not just to change individual legislation, but to change the whole climate of discussion of economic policy. Because if you can change the climate of opinion, there's no going back, all right? If you just get a piece of legislation that's changed, well, a new Congress can reverse that, pass a new law. But you can change the whole climate of opinion. That's for the long term. And that's what they were seeking to do. And that, in essence, is what they did. That, in essence, is what they did. All right? The problem they faced, and again, this is from the archives, from private discussions, is that they realized that this is a democracy, and the public was simply not going to go for the idea of redistributing wealth to the very rich. Why? Well, obviously, who wants to lower their living standards? It means most people should lower their living standards so that the very wealthy can have more. And naturally, they knew the public would not go for that. I should add, by the way, they tried. And they noted that they tried to basically go into working class communities and advocate for lower taxes on business, for example. And it failed completely. And they admitted it failed. And one of the things about the right that was very impressive is they had the ability to self-correct. They had a strategy. They would have a strategy, and if their strategy didn't work, they would change their strategy. They had no problem with that. I have to say, looking at the papers of these people, the private papers, the image I get was almost some of the best business figures. They acted like generals planning an offensive. I mean, they were that meticulous. They would lay out a strategy, and they would meticulously go about implementing their strategy. And if at any point their tactics didn't work, they would change their tactics and move to different tactics. They're very, it was somewhat impressive at that level. And I have to say, one of the things that's also impressive is were far and away better at the game of politics than anybody on the left, right, by a long shot. There's nobody on the left who even came close in terms of raw political skill and the ability to think strategically. Only the right did that by the 70s. Okay? So they met very little opposition, something I'll come back to. One more point, by the way, is that it is a myth of the 1970s that the reason you had a change of policy to the right, the reason there was a rightward shift in policy, was because the public turned right. All right? That's not true. All right? There was very little change in public opinion. In fact, there has been very little change over 50 years in public opinion, which continues to favor redistributive taxes and government intervention in the economy aimed at improving the condition of low-income groups, right? And labor unions, right? Labor unions remain very popular today. And so the idea that the 1970s was a period in which the public became more conservative, that was true in cultural issues, which I'll get to in a moment. It was not true in economics, all right? That was a purely elite event. It was the elites who became more conservative, all right? It was the elites who had accepted the New Deal begrudgingly, accepted labor unions, now came to reject them, and were determined to overturn all of that and push the economy in a free market direction advocated by Friedman. Okay? And one of the people I looked at most carefully is someone named Paul Weyrich, who was a new right activist from this period, who founded an organization called the Heritage Foundation. They were the ones, by the way, who created the 2025 project, some of you may have heard of, the Heritage Foundation. It was newly created in the 70s. Part of this deep lobbying operation, it was Weyrich that created it. And Weyrich had massive corporate funding. He was funded by the Coors family of the beer fortune, Coors Beer, as well as the Scaife Mellon fortune of the Mellon financial fortune, and ultimately Steele back in the robber baron days. And again, he comes off in private as a man of immense talent. And what he basically said is he wanted to learn from the old left. The old left created a mass base. You need a mass base because in a democracy you need votes. You need millions or tens of millions of people to support you. And he knew that business conservatism would not win over a mass base. And so he asked himself, how can he win over a mass base? And the answer was that social conservatism was very popular. Social conservatism. Economic conservatism was not, but social conservatism was. The United States is an exceptionally religious country. It's always been. Among advanced industrialized countries, the United States stands out as almost unique. And that as the country modernized, became more urban, more educated, most countries, as they become more urban and educated, become less religious. The United States did not, right? And in particular, what you have in the United States is a very large number of evangelical Christians, people who, again, I'm not an evangelical Christian, and I don't particularly feel one way or the other about evangelical Christianity. I really don't. So I'll just note this factually. Evangelical Christianity is based on the idea of a somewhat literalist interpretation of the Old and especially the New Testament, okay, and a personalized relationship between individual Christians and Jesus Christ based upon the idea of a life-changing, born-again experience, all right? That more or less defines evangelical Christianity. And this is separate from mainstream Protestantism, which tends to be less literalist in their interpretation and somewhat less emotional in terms of expression during prayer. Periodically, the U.S. has what are called awakenings, which is a massive upsurge of evangelical interest. In the 1970s, what was called the Fourth Great Awakening, where there was a massive upsurge of interest in evangelical Christianity, again, as separated from mainstream Protestantism. And this was, to some extent, a reaction against the counterculture of the 1960s. Things like abortion rights, feminism, gay rights, long hair on males, nudity in films, things like that. There was a tremendous conservative, socially conservative reaction against that manifested in increased interest in evangelicalism among Christians. And Paul Weyrich recognized this as a potential base to be used for business conservatism. Evangelicals were not interested in economics, all right? And many of them were working class. Generally speaking, evangelicals tend to be much more working class than affluent, all right? And say they were the people who had most to lose from Friedmanite economics. But Weyrich had the brilliant idea of what he called fusionism. Fusionism is the combining of different tendencies, and he wanted to link up economic conservatism and Friedmanite economics with social conservatism and appeals to Christianity, all right? And so, based upon his strategy, he, and again, the idea was bring people, different tendencies together to form a majority. What you want is a majority, right? You want a mass base, and the Christians would be the mass base. And he was very clear on this. And he used military language to describe it. He said, in a war you need not just generals, but you need divisions, okay, heavy divisions with large numbers of soldiers. The evangelicals would be the divisions, all right? And they would give us the political muscle we would need to push through our agenda, all right? And so many of the funders, the business funders, were encouraged to pour money into evangelical churches, which they did, and to form what was called the Christian right, Christian organizations that were explicitly political, all right? And the main thing they pushed, again, was social conservatism and contempt for the counterculture. Like I said, the hippies and, to put it simply and crudely, sex and drugs and rock and roll, they were against those things. And on the other hand, they're also encouraged to teach their followers Friedmanite economics. And Jerry Falwell, who was one of the leading ministers in this movement, he founded a group later called the Moral Majority, in close cooperation with Weyrich and with massive corporate funding. He instructed his followers that the New Testament basically anticipates free market economics. And he began quoting from scripture and melding it into quotes from Milton Friedman. And so he would promote free market economics, but most importantly, he would provide a mass base for free market economics, because the main thing that Christians were interested in was cultural issues, Another evangelical Christian who's worth noting is Billy Graham, who actually had been active since the 1940s. And Billy Graham was particularly noteworthy in that he had a very populist style. He was a Southerner who spoke with a Southern accent. To his credit, he was not a segregationist, and he didn't feel strongly about it, but he insisted from the beginning, from the 40s, in having integrated revivals. But he was always a very conservative, socially conservative figure. And during the 70s, he began getting massive funding from corporations. And he also became a major advocate for this combination of anti-unionism, free market economics, and above all, social conservatism and belief in Jesus Christ. And also, an obvious point that they really wanted to circumvent, you might say, the First Amendment and bring Christianity as much as possible into public life against secularism, which they opposed. And it is really remarkable, the corporate funding that these people attracted, including some of the largest oil companies, the Marriott Hotel Corporation. It seems big oil, for some reason, was especially interested in evangelical Christianity. Also, you began getting the rise of a new institution, which was Walmart, which is at the time not a national or international corporation it is today, but it was a regional corporation in the Ozarks in Arkansas. The president, the founder of Walmart, Sam Walmart, was actually not an evangelical. He was a mainstream Presbyterian, I believe. He was not interested in things like born-again experiences. That was just a little bit too far out for him. But the lower-level executives began to realize that the products that were selling best in Walmart stores in the 70s were Christian-related products, Christian-themed and Jesus-themed products. And so, as a sales strategy, they began really emphasizing Jesus-themed products and then Christianized the institution as a sales strategy. Also, They saw that Christianization was an excellent way to keep their labor force passive and keep unions out. That even if you have low wages and no benefits, it's not a problem because in the afterlife, you'll have a better life, was the message they tried to preach. And it was a good way of keeping a submissive workforce with very low wages on which they depended. And so, given that combination of variables, eventually it Christianized the whole institution. And now Walmart is essentially a Christian corporation, which it became, and became a source of funding and political backing and muscle for the Christian right by the late 70s. Okay. Now, a major advocate of this, one of the major advocates of this whole strategy, was Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon's an interesting figure because he's often thought of as a political chameleon who had no ideology. He was thought of at the time, and I think even surely in retrospect, as a president who, it's fair to say, had not much of a moral compass. I think that's a fair judgment on him. But he also didn't have an ideological compass. That was the vision he had, was no vision, basically. He would do whatever he needed to do to succeed. The phrase that his critics used was that he had no ideas, he had only political methods. All right? What I found in the archives is a very different Nixon. Nixon was an ideologue. He was a believer in free market economics. And behind the scenes, he cultivated Milton Friedman. And he was a big fan of Milton Friedman and met with him repeatedly from just before he was elected and throughout his administration. Friedman, by the way, never held any official position because he didn't like responsibility and accountability. He liked to be the man behind the scenes, which he was. You've all seen the Star Wars series, no doubt. Remember the character of Yoda? He was the Yoda of the period, shall we say. The wise man people would go to for advice. And Nixon did that as well. And consistent with this, Nixon seeded the federal bureaucracy with followers of Milton Friedman at the highest levels, ensuring that the Friedmanite turn in economics had real influence at the policy level in a way that would have permanent effects, right? And lasted well beyond the Nixon administration. Secondly, Nixon quietly leaned on private companies to contribute and help build up a right-wing intellectual infrastructure for new organizations like the Heritage Foundation and others like the American Enterprise Institute as a method of deep lobbying. I should add, business was completely ready to do this. So Nixon, you might say, was pushing on an open door because business was already ready to make such contributions. But the push from the White House made it happen a little bit faster. All right? Nixon, furthermore, was a major advocate of the culture wars. He aligned himself with evangelical Christianity. He aligned himself with what he called the silent majority, those who were socially conservative and did not like the hippies. They didn't like the culture of the New Left. By the way, it's very interesting to note that on substantive issues, the public agreed with a lot of the New Left, including the idea the rich have too much power. Quietly, the working classes, it turns out, were more hostile to the Vietnam War than the highly educated, contrary to popular belief. All right? The stereotype is that it was the affluent and the well-educated that opposed the war, all right, and that the working classes supported it. Not true. It's just the opposite. I think what the working classes didn't like was the culture of the New Left, the disrespect for the flag, the use of four-letter words in public, the long hair on males, these kinds of things. It was the cultural features of the New Left they didn't like, not so much their policies. But in any case, Nixon gained a lot of political dividends by aligning himself with evangelical Christianity. By the way, in private, Nixon was bored by church services. All right, so he was very cynical about how he operated. But in public, he appeared as a man of God, right? And was very close, particularly to Billy Graham. And he won the 1972 election for a lot of reasons, but one of them was that he was able to slice apart the Democratic coalition. Many working class people, working class Southerners especially, who had long voted for the Democratic Party for decades, switched to the Republicans, started to switch to the Republicans in 1972, giving Nixon his blowout victory over the Democrats in that year. Okay? And so you might say, as president, Nixon helped get the ball rolling. He did not engineer a policy change. He didn't have time. He wanted to do that in his second term. All right? He would start laying the groundwork for a policy change in his first term quietly. In his second term, he planned to launch an attack on the New Deal. He never got around to it, and the reason was, of course, Watergate. Watergate basically prevented him from doing this. It cut short his presidency, obviously, and the 19 months in his second term were dedicated to fighting off indictments and investigations. So he didn't have time, all right? After Watergate, however, the whole project forged ahead without Nixon. And business people themselves played the organizing role that Nixon had formerly played with enormous success. And this continued, basically, throughout the decade. And a particular flashpoint that's worth noting was in Kanawha County, West Virginia. There was a popular objection to new textbooks that taught about things like slavery and feminism and history of Indian massacres, and they taught things like the black author Baldwin, all right, and they had all sorts of quote-unquote heretical texts, and the public objected to this on cultural grounds. It was not their conservative Christian idea. I have to say, in this case, there's no doubt there was a certain amount of racism mixed in as well, which was also an important wedge issue, bear in mind. Although, on the other hand, it must be mentioned that blacks had a kind of ambivalence because evangelical Christianity is also very influential in the black community, and many African Americans were culturally conservative on sexual gender issues. The race is a totally separate thing. And in any case, in Kanawha County, it exploded into violence. You began getting, schools were bombed, there were shootings. The KKK came to town, the Nazi Party came to town, and the New Right saw an opportunity. The Heritage Foundation began giving them legal advice and advice on how to conduct themselves with the press. They encouraged it because, after all, that's exactly what they wanted. And the purpose was to divide the public, and they were open about that. Division here is what they wanted. They understood socialist strategy, and socialist strategy is you have a working class, and the working class fights for its interest against the wealthy. But if you can divide the working class along cultural lines, there's no possibility of opposition. And that's exactly what they did, and they did it very carefully and instrumentally, and with great skill and ability, I have to say. Okay, again, I'm very, very impressed by how skillful they were and how willing they were to change tactics whenever their tactics didn't work, and how much better they were than their opponents. Okay. I do want to, briefly touch upon the left during this period. And the left really offered no serious opposition. There were a number of reasons for that. One was that the union movement in the US, which was very large back then, I think in 1970 it was 25% of the labor force. Now it's 10%, right? And it was a major player in national politics. The problem was its most talented organizers had been destroyed by the Red Scares of the 1940s and early 50s. All right, one of the reasons I think you had the Red Scares was precisely because the union movement was getting too powerful, and this was a way of cutting them down to size, which it did, because their best organizers and best leaders were forced out of the movement. Some of them were put into prison. Okay, their lives were destroyed, and the people who survived the Red Scares had very low ability and were very right-wing. All right, and anti-communism was one of the main things that the union movement was steeped in. And again, I've been to the archives of the AFL-CIO, and one of the most important things they did in the 1970s is they worked very closely with the Central Intelligence Agency, doing covert operations against leftist parties overseas, all right? And it's amazing how much time and effort they put into that. And it seemed almost like among the leadership that was more important to them than building worker rights in the United States, because building worker rights is just boring, is how they looked at it. Okay, fighting communism with the CIA, that was exciting. And so the labor unions were, first of all, not a very effective bulwark against what was going on. So they just weren't that interested in the right-wing turn in economic policy. They were interested in foreign policy. Also, it also meant that they were very hostile to young people who'd come out of the anti-war movement, because they were pro-war. They supported the Vietnam War. And so there was a bitter animus between the labor unions, especially the AFL-CIO, and the New Left. And that breach in the left was so severe, it hobbled their ability to really do anything, right? And it was really a major defining feature. After the Vietnam War ended, or I should say after US combat involvement ended in '73, the anti-war movement itself ended. It's amazing how it went from being super powerful, able to turn out hundreds of thousands of people on the streets at a moment's notice, to being gone. So there was nothing left of it. And it's remarkable how quickly it just disappeared. And what came in its place, what we now call identity politics. Many of the people, the young people who were active in the New Left, went into single issue focus. Environmentalism was a big one, particularly anti-nuclear power was a big one. Feminism was another. There were separate organizations for African American, American Indian, and Latino organizations, often with a political bent, but nevertheless racially specific. And finally, a burgeoning gay rights movement. Nobody talked about trans in those days, at least not with any emphasis, but gay rights was a brand new idea, all right? And they did achieve significant successes. I mean, gay rights just didn't exist back then, and obviously the movements helped put it on the map as an issue. Women's rights were transformed, obviously also. But what it did mean also was that two things. First of all, these groups, almost by definition, had no ability to work together because they were the whole idea of identity politics is there's no overarching issue. It's separate identity groups. And also, they weren't interested in economics. They weren't interested in economics at all. And finally, they had mostly an affluent orientation, particularly this is true of the women's movement and the environmental movement. It was mostly people with advanced degrees and high incomes who were involved. Working class people mostly were not involved. And the organizing principle moved from the factory floor and the union hall, which is where it had been traditionally for the left, to the college campus. To the college campus. And increasingly, the language of the left became the language of the university seminar. It became very jargony and inaccessible to working people. All right? I don't think the word intersectionality didn't exist then, but words like that, we began to hear them a lot in the 1970s. And it actively alienated working people who felt the language was condescending and unnecessary. Okay? And it's amazing how the left insisted on using alienating language, even if it was obvious it was turning people off, and never correcting their mistakes. Again, the right, I was so impressed that the right corrects its mistakes. The left just doesn't do it. They double down on their mistakes. Decade after decade after decade. It's amazing. But that's a fundamental difference. The right thinks strategically, and the right aims to win. Okay? The left doesn't think strategically, and quite honestly, seems to not have that much interest in winning. Okay? Or is sort of indifferent to whether they win or not. More just the culture of protest, I think, is what motivates. The result of all this was that by the late 70s, when it has the image, once the right really got mobilized, and they came up against opposition, there was almost no opposition. The metaphor I would use, it was like a knife moving through butter. A knife moving through butter. Okay. It wasn't really that difficult for them once they really got their act together. And the place where it actually all came together, believe it or not, was the Carter presidency. Contrary to popular belief, the real shift to the right in economic policy, also in foreign policy, I should say, did not occur during Reagan. That's a myth. It began during the latter part of the Carter presidency. All right? In particular, the move to deregulation, including deregulation of finance, all that began under Carter. The assault against labor unions began under Carter. His principal advisor on deregulation, an economist named Alfred Kahn, later said, one of the things he really wanted to do was to make the auto workers and the truckers worse off. That's what he said. Okay? Just flatly said that. And again, I don't make judgments here. I'm just noting the facts. And finally, Carter introduced the idea of austerity as a means of fighting inflation. It's a complicated story, but in 1979, Carter appointed an anti-inflation hawk named Paul Volcker, who had a long experience in the banking industry, particularly Chase Manhattan. He was a protege of David Rockefeller. Carter actually offered the job to David Rockefeller, but he turned it down and recommended instead Paul Volcker. And Paul Volcker then began to engineer the deepest recession ever seen since the Great Depression. And the purpose was to suppress consumption and reduce living standards through increased unemployment, all right, as a means of fighting inflation. It eventually succeeded, all right, at the cost of permanently lowering wages, all right? This was presented as a temporary suffering people would go through. It wasn't temporary, all right? The average male wage in 2017 was lower than it was in 1970, all right? Wages never recovered from this recession. And that was to some extent a fulfillment of the objectives of Milton Friedman and of this massive lobbying campaign that he helped provide the brains for. And it was to concentrate wealth upwards, which is exactly what it did. One of the things that you see in the statistics is, if you look at the statistics, by the 1980s, the economy began to grow again. Growth did resume. But what was very striking about it is that growth and wages separated. In other words, during the 50s and 60s, when the economy grew, and particularly when productivity grew, wages would grow in tandem with overall growth, all right? After 1980, they separated, right? And wages remained stagnant or even declined, actively declined for quite a long time, in fact, whereas growth went up. And so the improvement in productivity, in efficiency, was not shared by wage earners, okay? And that was a new thing in American history. And that was a conscious policy. Again, that was not by accident, but by design. And that was the result of massive lobbying. By the way, Paul Volcker was an admirer of Milton Friedman. So again, he was operating on an ideological principle. And he was put in place by Carter, okay? He was put in place by Carter. So if you look carefully at the evidence, I think people have a very affectionate view of Carter because of his post-presidency, which was impressive in my view. And many people found impressive, and rightly so. But I think it really, if you look closely at his presidency, it was Reaganism before Reagan. And in a sense, you might say Reagan gets too much credit, or perhaps too much infamy, depending on how you look at it, in that the policies he's associated with really began by his predecessor, Carter. Fast forward to today, the culture wars have outlasted this episode and have become even more intense and more vitriolic. And once again, they're being funded again by the very wealthy. I just look at the woke corporation, as they're called. All right? Corporations have been adopting a lot of this terminology. They've been funding foundations that promote identity politics and language surrounding identity politics, where others, basically Charles Koch, for example, of Koch Industries, takes an anti-woke view. So corporations are on both sides of this issue. But I think that they like it because it distracts everybody from the issue of economic policy. Rather than discussing concentration of wealth, and at present the evisceration we're seeing of the federal government, people can focus much more heavily on things like Drag Queen Story Hour and fight about that. I think the wealthy, there's no doubt that's at least part of the issue is the wealthy see this as a strategy of distraction and division. And in the 1970s, they were frankly stating this, and I have no doubt that's what they're stating in private now. And so we still, to this day, are mired in the culture wars and continuing to perpetuate economic inequality and social misery for the majority. Thank you.